go ahead and get started here in just a minute. And just to pique your interest, you're in the right room if you're interested in learning exactly what's going to happen with the federal budget, like in any day now, right? That's what we're here to answer. Yeah. No, well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and excited to be with you all and with Tyler and Dan to be part of this discussion on how we build better relationships with our congressional delegation and how community-based organizations can really lean into those relationships to help further our work, and probably many other things that we'll learn this afternoon. I think it would be really helpful to just see who's in the room as we dive into this discussion. And I guess before we do that, I just want to let you know we have a little bit of a prepared outline, but certainly throughout this, we want to engage with you in that conversation. And if it's prompting questions with you, please let us know. And really, again, want to engage in more dialogue than just kind of speak at you about our experiences in a lot of ways. So who here works with a community-based organization? Wow. Yeah. Who here feels like they have an excellent relationship with their congressional delegation? If you're all in the right place, then perfect. And who's been to DC? Yeah, some of us. Cool. I know. Yeah, geography. So what parts of the state do we work within? Are we working in I-5 corridor? Yeah. Are we working outside of metropolitan areas or outside of urban areas throughout the state, or metro areas? Urban, rural is always an interesting definition. Yeah, cool. So like any that straddle the river. Yeah, cool. What other questions do we have? Get a pulse of the audience. We're good. All right. Well, again, excited to be with you, and hand it over to, I guess I wanted to also just acknowledge, I think in the workshop description, there was called Old Hands here. So this has been a challenge for us to really checking out our hands. Are we old hands? Are in this? But there's a lot to learn from the experience of both Tyler and Dan. So I'm going to hand it over to you all to dive in here a little bit.
Great. Thanks, Joel. Nice to see you all here today. My name's Dan Marr. I work for United States Senator Jeff Merkley. I'm what our office calls a field representative. So I work in a number of counties representing the senator. It's my job to be the eyes and ears for Jeff Merkley, working with organizations in the community who, working on policy, seeking project funding, just working in that government space. The senator really tasks us to be just another voice at the table, solving problems at the local level. And so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the Senate, and then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague here, Tyler, who works for Congressman Blumenauer over on the House side. So this might feel a little schoolhouse rocky to begin with, but we're just going to talk real quick about the Senate, the House, the differences in how our offices are structured. So of course, the Senate, 2 senators per state. Here in Oregon, of course, our senators are my boss, Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden. The House, of course, is divided up by district. And so here in Oregon, we've got 6 districts. So the senators, of course, we're statewide. And so we've got a statewide team here in Oregon that does basically the things that I just described in my role as a field representative. We've got a number of offices around the state. Let's see if I can get them on the first go. Portland, Salem, Eugene, Medford, Bend, Baker. Those are our offices. And so we are divided up in the state team on geography. Over on the DC side, we've got a team of about 25 people who cover the policy work in Washington, DC. And so these are the folks that are working with Senator Merkley when the Senate is in session. These folks are divided up by policy area. So each office does it a little bit differently. Our team has a couple folks, a legislative assistant and a legislative correspondent, who cover housing work for the senator. There's usually a kind of a couple big issues in each portfolio. So our housing team covers housing, immigration, labor, and a couple other smaller issues. And so those are the folks who advise the senator, who work with, Jeff Merkley to understand what his values and goals are in the housing space. And then to help him both, write legislation that, matches those values and advances his interests. But it's also their job to work on the policy that's introduced by other senators. And, consider, what that policy is trying to do, decide whether or not Senator Merkley is going to co-sponsor, and how he's going to engage in this legislation as it goes through the policymaking process. And so those are the folks back there in DC. They're the people that you'll meet with when you travel to Washington, DC. And, quite frankly, I mean, compared to those of us in the state, they're way deeper on policy than the state team folks usually are. So here on the state side, I think we're going to talk a little bit about building bridges with the congressional offices. In my mind, that really starts at the state level. Definitely folks do fly to DC and just, start engaging with our policy team, right off the bat. We typically advise to start at the state level, work with your local field representative to help understand what your organization is, what they're doing, what your projects are, and to think about, how our office can help. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler, who can talk a little bit about the House side.
Thanks, Dan. My name's Tyler Frisbee. I use she, her pronouns. I work for Congressman Blumenauer, who represents Portland out Hood River. Sorry, I don't normally have a mic problem. Can you hear me? All right. Is it coming in and out? Okay. I'll get the battery. That one? Yeah. Thank you. Is this better? Cool. All right. So the Congressman's district is most of the east side of Portland, all the way out to Hood River, and then up Mount Hood. So Dan and I we are old hands. We've been around for a little while. I worked for the Congressman for about 7 years in DC, then did some other things for a while, came back home, and then, as they say, the boss always likes to say that working for him is not a life sentence, but I appear to be disproving that, and I've been back with him for a little over 6 months now. So like Dan said, I think talking about the House and the Senate and understanding how those offices are set up is important. And I am going to reiterate what Dan said, which is your relationship should start at the state level. The good news is that's a lot cheaper and it's a lot easier. So I think it gives you a chance to really show off the work that you do best. Most House offices are set up pretty similar to the Senate offices, but they are a lot smaller. So for us, we have about 10 legislative staff plus the comms person and the scheduler in DC. And we have about 7 or 8 folks here. And that makes up our district. So we cover all, that whole area all the way out from Portland, all the way out to Hood River, and then all the same policy issues and issue areas that are covered on the Senate side. House side tends to have slightly younger staff, particularly in DC, and they are covering more issues. So one of the things I always tell folks when you're meeting and working with House staff, and I think it's true for Senate staff too, as Dan said, their job is to know all the policy pieces, but it's also to know all the components of what's happening in DC, right? What members love this idea? What members hate this idea? What the committee chairman has said or chairwoman, what advocacy groups are really engaging with this productively? What advocacy groups are being a giant pain in the ass? Excuse me, I will swear throughout the course of this presentation, but I'll try not to. And so, one of the things that I always try when I'm helping folks prep to go to DC or when I'm working with folks here is, look, my job is to know a lot about the policy work and about the work that you're doing, but it's also to know all the other pieces, right? All this sort of other DC Congress stuff. So don't expect your folks to know all the ins and outs of your daily program. If you're coming up and you're talking about, you're assuming they know the amount that your rents increased last year and the challenges of X and Y and Z, that's too down in the details, right? They're going to understand the programs, they're going to understand the intention of those programs, and they're going to be able to tell you, here's who else loves that program, here who has concerns about that program, here's the shit we hear about that program, or make sure when you're meeting with this other member of Congress from Oregon that you're framing the program this way, because they get really angsty when they hear the program talked about this way. That's the sort of work that a congressional staffer will do. So that's one of the things I like to start off with is be ready to sort of talk about your program, help them understand why it matters and help them understand the impact that you're having on the ground, because that's the stuff that that you can communicate to them to help them to care. I think we're going to go into specifics, but I'm going to just sort of quickly talk about the 3 principles that I encourage folks to think about when they're engaging. The first is know that you have a lot to offer, right? You have a great story. You are doing work to help their constituents, and you have a perspective and an on-the-ground experience that really matters. So be proud of that. Be prepared and excited to tell that story. The second is be willing to help them understand what that means for their boss, right? If you just come in and you're like, hey, here's what we're doing, we have this many units, this is the next project that's in the works, that's not really going to sink in. What you want to say is that means that we've housed in the last year, we've gotten 70 families housing, and that, that housing is permanent, or we're not sure, what that looks like. And here are the things that we're asking for. The second piece, and this can be a little bit harder, is make sure that your asks are timely and relevant. So this week is a great week. This is not a great week to be coming to your member of Congress and asking to start to engage in some super wonky, down in the weeds, major cost increase program. Everyone is slowly losing their minds right now. Some of them not slowly. And so that's sort of one part of being timely, but it's also thinking about what are the bills that are moving? If we just reauthorized the bill that you're coming to talk to us about last year, and you're coming to say, I want this change and we need it now, or all these folks are gonna, or this whole program falls apart for us, that congressional office is gonna look at you and say, you need to talk to us about that last year. I can't do anything about that now until reauthorization in 4 years. And so think about, know when you need to be working with them and how to be preparing with them. That doesn't mean you can't be creative, right? I've supported folks and worked with folks of like, oh, you have a workforce housing issue? Let's see if there's something in the workforce education bill that we can maneuver around that, because the relevant housing bill went through last year and it's not going to come around again. But let's see if we can look at something in workforce. So be relevant, be timely. And then the third piece is be persistent. I think Dan outlined, while it sounds like a lot of staff, when you hear 25 people, they are covering folks across the state. And essentially the legislative staff is covering stuff across the country, right? They need to know what's happening everywhere. So we're all busy. Everyone is busy. I don't mean to suggest that anyone is busier than anyone else, but you are often being helpful if you're coming back and saying, hey, we talked about this 6 months ago. I want to let you know, here's a new development in this, or another story that drives home how important this is. This continues to be an issue for us. We're working with the rest of the delegation. I just wanted to check in and see if you have any thoughts. These are often changing things at the congressional level is a multi-year process. Part of the reason I came back to work for my boss is all the stuff that I'd worked on him between 2008 and 2014, most of it finally passed, getting wrapped up in IIJA and IRA. And he's like, you want to come do the next round of this? That next round is going to take 10 years, right? It's like everything that I had worked on took 16 years to move. And now I get to come back and think about how you build on it. So these are not 6-month projects, year-long projects. These are long-term things.
Can I add something quick? Something to add to that. And after this is over, we can get some information to send out. Something that our office creates is a map of Oregon's 36 counties in which field representative covers which county, and it has contact information on there. So we can see if conference organizers can get that out to everyone. Super handy tool. Definitely agree with everything Tyler just said. One thing, I think of state staff as one of the roles we play is kind of being the navigator for the rest of our organization. We like to take a no wrong door kind of policy with Senator Merkley's team. So if you get a hold of anybody from our team and express what you need from us, that person should be able to point you in the right direction. And I tell folks to rely on me. If they're booking a trip to DC and they want to talk policy with our team, I ask that they loop me in on their scheduling emails to DC to make sure that I can kind of keep prompting DC to be responsive, or help ask some questions ahead of time to help our partners prepare, their materials and their talking points for when they get to DC. So definitely do take advantage of those relationships in the state. And in the district, and it's good policy to be in close contact with with that individual. Have them out, invite them out for coffee. If there's a project you're working on, if there's a piece of land you've acquired that you foresee building a development on, have them out, go walk around, check out the dirt. Help them understand what's really going on in the state. It's good for their knowledge, but it's also good because there's a whole other body of work that goes on. And I mean, Tyler knows this well, between the DC team and the state team, where the DC team is considering where the senator or the member of Congress puts their resources and time. And the state team is kind of part of that. And so having that individual be ready to share your story and your experience is pretty valuable. And I want to ask Joel. So of course, Joel works in 2 different states. So he gets the pleasure of maintaining relationships with 4 United States senators and 4, if not more, members of the House of Representatives. Joel, do you have anything to add to best practices here?
It's a loaded question. No, I was actually also thinking about a question, but for me, one of the things that I continue to just remind myself, we're all people, right? We're living in our communities, we're living in our states, we're obviously interested in affecting positive influence where we can. And so some of my first visits with congressional delegation, I was so nervous and wondering how I was going to be prepared enough and all of that. And really, it's all about relationship building and understanding and recognizing that those relationships are important to build and maintain over time. And the rest comes up way easier when we have those relationships. So focus on that. Remember that we're all people trying to do good work. I was curious just to get a pulse from the folks in the room, the state office, right? Who's engaging with the state offices around? This map is going to be really important to get out. So we'll make sure to get that out and send it through whatever avenue we can. I don't have a sign up list here, but I'm looking at some teammates that maybe have ideas for other ways we can get the information on. Perfect. And
I'll provide my or the name of the search.
It's a PDF that I'll have to send around after the fact.
Okay,
so
I'll make sure you have my contact.
great. We'll make sure to get the state office maps and the kind of state staff contacts out to folks. We want to kind of dive into some specifics, right? I know, Tyler, you were diving in a little bit on legislation and affecting policy. If there's any more specifics you want to dive into there. I know another probably hot topic is, how can the delegation really support specific funding requests? And, I don't know if we're ready to use the term earmarks again, but there's certainly been some congressionally directed spending in the last few years. And so maybe we can dive in a little bit, go another level deeper here as you share your wealth of knowledge with us.
Great. So I'll talk a little bit about project funding, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the term earmarks, right? This is where Congress sends money directly to a project in the community. It doesn't get routed through an agency. It's just something that a member of Congress decides is worthy of federal investment. They work some sort of wizardry behind the scenes, and then that project gets that money. That's the way it worked for a good long time, right up until about 2011, when some shifting politics in the House of Representatives changed, and a few notable earmarks throughout history became talking points. The bridge to nowhere in Alaska, I believe, is the most commonly known. and so about, 10, 12 years ago, Congress decided to shutter the practice of earmarking or directly funding projects through Congress. And so for 10 or 12 years, we didn't have this tool. So all the federal funding, all that money that's appropriated, it was all routed through the agencies. And so while it took away these these examples of pork barrel spending or whatever opponents like to call it, it did something else, and it put the power of funding more in the hands of the agencies and the agency staff, which is really great. There's a lot of great people at the agencies who make good decisions, but it also happens behind the curtain, and there's not the accountability that your members of Congress have to face as they seek their regular elections. And so Congress for many years talked about bringing earmarks back, and just in the last 3 here has kind of tiptoed back into that practice, starting with fiscal year 2022. And so earmarks are back, as they say. We try not to use the term earmarks. Senator Merkley likes to call this community initiated project funding. The Senate specifically calls it congressionally directed spending. The House calls it
Community directed spending, I think.
community project funding. There's a lot of names for it, but it's the same. It's basically earmarks nouveau. There's a new process. So, previous to 2011, Congress would just it was more of a blank check approach. These days, it's a much narrower window and type of money that can be earmarked. And so the money has to flow through existing programs in the agencies. So there's a lot more process to it. It's also more transparent. Every member of Congress has a website now. And so as part of the agreement to bring earmarks back, it's become a requirement to post online everything that a member of Congress requests. And so once a year, around February or March, Congress puts out the call for ideas for project funding. And so not every member uses this practice. There's about, out of the 100 senators in the US Senate, I'd say about 70 actually engage in the practice. In the House, it's probably 2/3 of the 435 that take earmark funding.
Yeah, it's basically all of the Democrats and about 1/3 of the Republicans last year.
Yep. And engaged in the project funding. So here in Oregon, both senators do make project requests, and out of our 6 members of the House, 5 put in requests. So the only one that doesn't is Congressman Bentz from Oregon's 2nd congressional over in the far eastern and southern parts of the state. And so zooming into the housing realm a bit here. So there are 12 appropriations bills that get passed every year, or that are supposed to get passed every year. So they, agencies are lumped into groups. So for housing and urban development, that agency is paired up with transportation. And so that's packaged into an appropriations bill called THUD, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. Some people call it THUD. I prefer THUD. And so, in the past, so, being just back on earmarks for 2 full years, we'd have a little bit of a taste of what's getting funded. And so I know Joel has successfully applied a couple times and got funding for 2 projects in the Columbia River Gorge, I believe. Was it $2 million for the Rand Road project?
Yeah, in both cases. And just to be clear, this is not Joel. These are community initiated projects that have been funded in the Columbia River Gorge. And, housing has certainly been a big focus of our senators in Oregon and frankly in Washington as well. And I think also on the House side, housing continues to be a priority, which is maybe why you're here at the Housing Oregon Conference too. But it's been a great opportunity to look at those community initiated projects and look at how we're leveraging the potential for that federal funding that we can bring back to the state, and then oftentimes maybe go back even for other federal funding and really, making the capital stack work. And it really has been the importance of timing and awareness, right? I've definitely been on other projects where it's like, oh shoot, I missed that form filing deadline. Like there are really important deadlines that we need to hit. And it certainly doesn't hurt to have just more awareness before those deadlines are coming up. So the springtime, historically in the last few years, that's been the time, right? And it's okay to, if you're not on the short email list that is automatically getting those forms, to be like, hey, I hear that there's requests out there for community initiated projects, and find those state staff points of contacts to at least get access to the forms. It's one of the best ways to get your project on the radar.
It is okay, but I will also encourage all of you to at least have one meeting with your congressional office before those forms come out, so they know who you are, they know a little bit about what you do, and so that you are on the short list for getting the email, because that is how you know when the deadlines are coming up. It's usually February. It's always earlier than you think. And this is where that relationship really starts to matter. Ideally, you want the congressional folks to be knowing what you're doing and why you're there before you're asking for money. Sorry.
I want to know, that's a great reminder. I want to dive into that process a little bit too, because, we're talking about forms in spring of the season, right? But yet, have we passed an appropriations bill yet this year, for example?
No.
And I know we started out by saying, maybe we will this week, maybe we won't. So what happens if appropriations bills don't get passed, and instead there's a continued resolution? What happens to these community initiated project requests?
Sure. If there's a continuing resolution that just, bumps us out another couple of weeks or a couple of months to give Congress more time to get their bills, together and get them passed, then, then those projects they're still in the draft bills. And we still have faith that those bills will get passed and that those projects will all be included. There is another way that could go down, and that it's a series of continuing resolutions, which means instead of passing the next year's federal spending bill, the agencies just continue to spend at the previously appropriated amounts. And so we're working in the fiscal year 2023 budget right now. If we don't reach a budget bill by this Friday, the end of the fiscal year, which there's no way that's going to happen, we're going to kick it forward into a continuing resolution. So those agencies will be spending at the FY23 levels, even though it's now FY24. In the last two fiscals, it was around the holidays when the budget was finally passed. And so Congress passed continuing resolutions from the end of the fiscal on the 30th of September through to around, I think it was like December 21st or 22nd when they passed these last couple of years. I think the year before that, it was sometime in March, which is getting kind of comically late into the fiscal. It's over half the way into the fiscal already. But in this new era of earmarks, those projects should be staying in the draft spending bills until either the bills are passed and then the projects get funded, or Congress gives up and an omnibus is passed, or Congress just passes a year-long continuing resolution that gets us to the end of the fiscal. That's the eventuality we really don't want to see. In that case, projects get stripped out and nobody gets that funding. The agencies continue to spend at the 23 levels, which is very difficult for the agencies to having to plan ahead and to budget. Costs increase. Staffing turns over, just creates a lot of uncertainty, and it's and also with the looming shutdown too, it's all that times 10 here. So hopefully things can get settled back in DC, and we can get a reasonable continuing resolution and buy us enough time to actually pass these spending bills. I should have gathered some stats on the number of projects that are in the draft bills. I want to say Senator Merkley has something like 130 community projects in the draft appropriations bills, varying in size from $150,000 to $3 or $4 million. So there are a lot of really great projects, headed towards a lot of really worthy organizations in the state. So fingers crossed.
I think it's about 1,400 throughout the various bills is what I heard. But I will just flag partly, and this is my personal opinion, having seen this for a while, I think earmarks, community initiated spending, community directed spending, they get a lot of airtime. They're kind of sexy. Partly also folks who have been working in federal affairs issues for a really long time. Remember the glory days of the 90s when you were getting $8 million, $9 million, $10 million, very little work. We always passed our appropriations bills on time in May, June, or July. So like by the time you sat down in September, you knew you were getting that money, you could budget, you could plan your project. It realistically does not work like that anymore. So I like to caveat that because I don't want folks to get sort of lured in by this concept. You know, sometimes they're getting as much as $3 or $4 million, but a lot of them are a lot smaller. We had a major problem this last year where they based the committee, mostly the chairman, they just took a haircut to every project that came in. So we got a lot of projects, but the committee awarded them about 70% of what they asked for. That's a real problem if you're trying to actually build a project. And we've had a lot of back and forth with the chairman around that. That happened to every member across the board. But you do have, you know, at the end of the day, that is a real possibility. And it is also a real possibility that you're sitting around December 20th being like, are they going to pass? Am I going to be in this? I need to build it. Like, I need to put a work order. I need an RFP. I need to do something. And I can't because I don't know. And so I will just say, having worked on this in the local government side, and I think, you know, trying to prepare an earmark and go through that process, my capital project folks wanted to kill me because I couldn't tell, you know, like, when are we going to have this money? And I was like, well, when Congress passes the appropriations bills. So I do want to, as you think about various funding options, this, you know, community directed spending is always a good option, but it comes with some risks. And I think particularly in this moment, my boss is also really with IIJA and IRA out there. Our office is trying to spend as much time supporting people and helping people and looking at grant opportunities through those programs, instead of, because in a lot of ways, there's more stability and more consistency than the community directed spending.
Yeah, maybe we can talk a bit about what the process is actually like what you have to do to get, you know, to get in the queue for this project funding. So, Joel, I'll ask if you can add some color commentary along the way here too. But, you know, like we said, the deadline, the application window for this is usually about 2 weeks. It used to be in March, used to be like March to April. Last year, I think it was like maybe even late February or early March. So, you know, it's just kind of based on the timing of what the subcommittees are doing in Congress. And so I advise folks to kind of have your ducks in a row by January or early February, you know, and by that time have already had contact with your delegation offices, probably the folks on the state side. It's really good policy to be thinking about this now. Think about the projects that you have on the horizon, what needs funding, where it is, where you're at with your capital stack. You know, what we've seen around the state. I mean, a typical award is $1 million to maybe $3 million, I think, is about the max we've been able to get for a housing project. But again, you know, your state folks, your field representatives here in Oregon are going to be your best navigators, and they can talk a little bit about you know what their boss's priorities are. You know, there are a lot of dynamics with this that we won't get into now. But you know, since housing and transportation are packaged in the same bill, the way it works, each office gets kind of a certain number, a certain, you know, a cap. Say each office gets to appropriate about $30 million between everything in the THUD account. And so, you know, that member has to make decisions about where that money is going to go. And so housing is competing with transportation and other programs of the sort. Again, now's, you know, good timing now in the fall. It's not past the fiscal yet, so we can actually attend. We're not going to be furloughed. So we get to be here today. That's wonderful. But you also still have plenty of time ahead of our appropriations deadlines to talk with our offices.
Yeah, one of the other things that jumps out for me is awareness of, you know, as you're navigating the form or requests, like all of these community initiative projects need to flow through an existing account, right? Or an existing program within our federal government. So for example, some of the more recent housing investments that have come through in previous appropriations bill flow through housing urban developments, community project funding account, which is in their economic development. So, don't wait till the last minute of filling out the forms, because you have to identify which account is preferable for it to come through in those congressionally directed or community initiated project requests. And then just on the backside, just know that that's part of the process, right? Is working with the federal agencies that will be then if you're successful in getting your project funded, to be working with those agencies to navigate the particular grant agreement that comes through. So don't just, I guess what I'm saying is it's not just a check that comes your way. You probably didn't think that would be the case anyway. It will come through that relationship eventually with your federal program partners that you most often work with as well.
Yep, and our offices typically have an online portal that you can log into and kind of fill out a series of check boxes, information, et cetera. We do ask that you provide 3 letters of community support for your project. And those can be whoever you think are good community partners who can vouch for your project. We also ask that that you attach a budget document. It doesn't have to be super detailed. We just want to have a good idea of, kind of like where in your funding stack will this funding be. Federal money doesn't like to be the first in the door. That's a true fact. However, it's also difficult, given that this moves at the speed of Congress, to get the timing right, to where the federal money shows up at the right time. Assuming you do apply, you are successful, the process moves through, and the money does eventually get to you. There's some stipulations there. Typically, it can't be used for reimbursement, so you can't build a new wing onto your building a year ago and then get a reimbursement once the federal funding shows up. There's typically a window in which you have time to spend that money.
And thank you for those tips and reminders too. And my reflection is that, again, they're often not the sole source, if ever, the sole source of funding in a project, and are often leveraging other federal programs. And I guess maybe that's a good segue into, we wanted to make sure we talk about, not just specific funding requests, but as an industry, as affordable housing industry, one of the things we've done really well together is work together in, increasing the pie, not just slices of pie that we're working on, and helping to increase the federal investments in housing, state investments as well. So maybe you two could talk a little bit more about particularly kind of more global budget advocacy, how that works in the process too, and how to best engage with your offices in that.
Yeah. I think this is an important piece, and I get a little bit worried sometimes, just like, oh my God, we've now spent 30 minutes on earmarks, and actually that's not everyone's bread and butter, right? That's a great, often one-time solution for a project, but the bread and butter is the federal money that comes in that keeps these programs functional year after year after year. And as practitioners, y'all know better than I do, all of the programs that come together to make your work possible. But a lot of those are due to consistent, sustained advocacy at the federal level. And I think one of the things that happens oftentimes for Congress is particularly some of these programs that have been around for so long, LIHTC, some of these the congressional offices are like, yep, they're working, they're great, we just got to keep them moving. And they forget the power and the impact that they have on people's lives. And so I think one of the real gifts that all of you can do in working with your congressional office is helping them understand, look, here's how we use, here's how LIHTC played a role in the projects we built this year. Here's how we use these other pieces. We use this grant program. We did this work. Here's how these tax credits came together. And I think telling the story for people, helping them understand how important it is. There are national advocacy groups who were formed 30, 40 years ago for the sole purpose of keeping those programs alive and increasing the amount of funding that's available to them. Most of them, I was going to say for better or for worse, but frankly, for worse, I think, from my boss's perspective and from all of our perspectives, need funding on it. They're not mandatory programs, right? They're reliant on consistent, whether it's appropriations activity every year or authorization activity every 5, 6, sometimes more years. And that is the work that these advocacy organizations and you have been doing to help prop up those programs and help people know how important they are. So we're going to talk in a bit about, how to really build that relationship with your congressional office over the long term. But I think what I want to highlight is it's really important, and it's beyond just a one-time earmark request or, some sort of emergency alert that you get from the national org that you're a member of. It is about helping people understand the on-the-ground impacts of these projects. Because I will tell you, having worked both in DC and here, you're getting emails and calls from the national orgs constantly, and that's great. But the story that gets put in the memo that goes to my boss is the one I get from the group in Oregon that says, here's what we did this year. Here's the number of families that we housed. Here are the kids who were at risk of homelessness, who are now, in a home, have a roof over their head. Those are the stories that get put in about the programs that go to my boss. So I think that's really important. And I think, frankly, if I were going to tell you, how many folks here, just out of curiosity, have an org that has a dedicated federal affairs person? I was going to say, is there a single one? No. So you're all squeezing this in when you have so much other work to do, right? And I would tell you to focus on that long-term bread and butter work and making sure you're lucky, I will say, in that most of the Oregon delegation, I think, really understands and connects with your work. So you're not having to convince people, but you do want to make sure they're there for you when you need it. We have some really well-placed members of Congress. We're very lucky, and senators. I'm going to say particularly Chairman Wyden on the Finance Committee. A lot of the things that the housing world relies on run through the Finance Committee. And so helping make sure he's not just a yes, but like a gold star, check plus, yes, that can make a big difference. And that honestly is the work that all of you do. As much as the national organizations are really important, the day-to-day Oregon stories and Oregon impact are what has that difference.
And those are important to our bosses, to Chair Wyden, that, when he's talking about these programs, to be able to share stories about how this impacts folks, back home. That's absolutely important.
Yeah, let's dive into some specifics again, specific questions. So if I were gonna approach Congressman Blumenauer's office for the first time, how would I do it? Would I say, Tyler, let's go for a bike ride? You like to go biking? Yeah. Is that the way to do it? Or Senator Merkley's office, are you learning any wind sports out in the gorge, Dan? What's going on here? How do I engage with you for the first time?
Okay, well, I'm always happy to go for a bike ride with you, Joel. But I would pick up what Dan said. The plus of having the state staff is that we actually do get to go see things on the ground. I think this is also true for our bosses, for the electeds. But I would start with the state staff. So for the two senators' offices, Dan mentioned they have field reps for every county in Congressman Blumenauer's office, and most of the House offices. They're small enough that if you call the front office, they're going to say, housing. They're going to say, great, we have a housing field rep. For Congressman Blumenauer's office, that's me. So everyone in the 3rd district, come hang out with me. But reach out, and I always suggest a tour. Start with a tour. And if you've got something new, that's great. If you don't, right, that, particularly if you're building a relationship, look, we realized we're doing a ton of work and we want to make sure your boss knows about it. Can we come tour? Can you come look at this project we've been working on putting together? Do you want to come see this community center we're working on that also has affordable housing next to it, that's doing X and Y? Can you come see this project that we need to figure out how to fund because it is in need of major rehabilitation? And doesn't need to be a big all-day thing, right? Like an hour tour, a chance to chat, and then think about, what are you sharing? I've worked a lot, both in my old job, helping people. I think sometimes folks get in front of their congressional office and they want to either say everything that's terrible and how nothing is working, or talk about how they're doing such great work and they're totally fine. And you actually need a little bit in between, right? You want to say, here is all the really good work we're doing. here are the ways that we need support from the federal government, right? Here's the things at the federal level that are making things really hard. Extra gold stars if you can distinguish between federal level work and state level work. But I will tell you, for the state offices, we're friendly enough, like we're gonna help you navigate that, right? We're gonna help you figure that out. We're gonna say, oh, that's a state challenge, but here's the federal component of that. Or frankly, and I know Dan does this too, if you've got something stuck in a federal office and you're struggling, sometimes we can just call over and find out what's happening and help provide some input. So, I think it's good to be able to distinguish between those two components, but we're also here to help and be part of that process. So I'd say start with a tour, but I know I'll always go on a bike ride, and I think Dan's learning to win foil, so.
We just want to add to that, staffer to staffer, their knowledge and skill sets can vastly differ. Sometimes we'll have folks come to our office and be a field representative, and they'll come from a housing agency or an advocacy group that works on X, Y, or the other thing. A lot of us are kind of, Jacks and Jills of all trades. And so remember that it's helpful for us to understand what you're working on and kind of the policy nuance that you understand, because that helps us be better in our jobs.
This is also my personal horse that I've been trying to ride for a long time. I think the trip to DC is dead. Sorry. But I will say, I tried to kill it, the annual trip at the agency I worked at for 7 years, and was unsuccessful because people have a lot of emotional attachment to it. But you are more powerful getting, if you're in DC, you're gonna get 15 minutes with a senator or with a congressman or congresswoman. Maybe you're going to get half an hour with a staffer. They are going to have 9 other meetings that day that have the same amount of time. And it is really overwhelming. So if you are back here at home, if you can get on the senator's calendar or the congressman's calendar, you're going to get an hour and a half, maybe just an hour, but like you're going to get some real quality time. You're easily going to get an hour with a staffer. And probably an hour every 6 months or that sort of thing. So I really encourage folks, invest in the relationships here at home. I said this when I was a DC staffer too, it's not self-serving. Because in terms of money and time, you're gonna get a lot more of a relationship out of that. DC's fun, so I'm not hating on going to DC, but for building those relationships, I think your story is so much more powerful when you can stand in front of the work that you're doing and really show them and have a bit more time.
Yeah, I think I'd want to add to that too. It's like, I always enjoy a meeting more when the person I'm meeting with has some like genuine interest in like Jeff Merkley and what he's doing and what his other priorities are, right? Like he cares very deeply about housing and works a lot in that space. He also cares a lot about climate and other issues and just kind of, like teasing that out of the staffer and better understand kind of what the electeds kind of what their values are can really help foster that relationship. And like Tyler said, definitely getting staff out is a really great first step. You don't have to have like a full robust agenda of nuanced policy to talk through the first time you meet with somebody from one of our offices. You can just say, hey, this is a relational thing. Want to get to know you, want to share what our organization has been doing, hear about the senator's priorities and how we can work together.
So we intentionally didn't lump in the question of like, how do we make the ask, or what's the best approach to ask for things, right? First, we're meeting with you, we're connecting with you, building that relationship. What do we need to know about making the ask?
For starters, I'd say be direct about it. And we expect that to come. And when it doesn't come, we can kind of be scratching our heads a little bit and be like, what are we doing here? But meetings and, can be just relational, right? And educational. But yeah, certainly if there's something in the federal sphere that you need or some information that you want from us, just ask.
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate that and say, be prepared. You may have to put a little context around it. Here's the challenge we're having. Here's why we've been told this is a federal thing. Here's what we think we need. And your ask can be that. Your ask can also be, we don't know if this is a federal thing. Can you help us figure it out? Particularly for the Oregon staff, our job is to not be scary. I know Joel said he felt intimidated. That is the opposite of the vibe that we should be putting forth. So we are here to be supportive. And I will agree with Dan. If I have a meeting and I'm like, they didn't have a single thing that they want me to do or know about or think about, like, okay. I mean, I'm not mad about it, but I am a little confused. So that's part of what we do.
Yeah, I worked with Congress before I worked for Congress and experienced that same thing for sure.
Great. Reflecting on something that I feel like has been helpful to the delegation and this awareness of, like, we're lucky in the Northwest that we have senators that work together within the state, but also, straddle the river. There's common interests, not just within our state. Congress is the same way in a lot of cases. And so one of the things that I've felt has been helpful is helping make that connection, right? Like, we're engaged in industry groups that aren't just Oregon focused in a lot of ways. And so how can we bring that into that relationship building and making sure that this is actually not just an Oregon thing? This is a lot bigger deal, and how can we pull in other partners has seemingly been helpful to be able to do that. I think about another specific thing within our industry around, fair market rents being an issue that some of us that work in the housing world really know, right? And again, just sharing, like, it's not just a Wasco County fair market rent issue. This is an issue that affects other fair market rent areas throughout the state, and helping just lift that up when we're telling our story and making the ask of, like, yeah, we need to do something different than what we've been doing around fair market rents for years and years and years. And look, all of these other areas are challenging HUD's fair market rents. So yes, let's keep going in those appropriations bills or other statutory changes that our representatives and senators are working on. So let's have, like, a tidbit of, like, how can you help the delegation in, like, a sentence or two? And then while you're thinking about that, from both of you, I want everybody else to be thinking about all the hard questions that I can come bring the mic to you on, and you can ask Dan and Tyler those questions here in just a minute.
I think the thing that you can do to help us help you is put stories and real life numbers between programs. A lot of these things exist. It's hard to sort of think about realistically, is this program more impactful? Is it really helping people? What does it mean? And I will say, right now, as an example, we're preparing for a shutdown. If I'm putting any money on anything, I'm telling you it's a shutdown. And frankly, the question, I think, on the House side in particular right now is how long. It's a really hard, Speaker McCarthy has no ability to pass something without strong Democratic support, and that's a thing he's not willing to do. And so I think we're in a waiting game. But I've been calling around to a lot of folks that I work with, and my first question is, hey, is there anything that a shutdown's going to, are you waiting on something from the feds that you need soon that I can try to rush through in the next 4 days before there aren't people working? Are there things that we should be trying to get in sort of an emergency CR to keep it, like there's a big push to try to get WIC into an emergency CR so that we're not leaving millions of mothers and new babies and young children unfed for however long the shutdown lasts. But are those things at sort of that level that we should be pushing? That's my first question. How can we help you? What do we need to be worried about? And then my second question is, are there impacts to your community that you can tell me about that I can use to help my boss talk about this? And to talk about, when we talk about this impacting Oregonians and Washingtonians, because we do actually work very closely on all sides of the river, but how can you help me help my boss understand that and put a name and a face to that? So stories.
Yep, that's right. Help us tell the story about federal resources deployed and talk about the great work that you're all doing for our shared constituents.
Great.
5 minutes of lightning round.
Lightning round, we get a little bit more than that, maybe. We have plenty of time for questions, and we're intentional about leaving a lot of space for questions. So I hope there are a lot of questions while we have Dan and Tyler here. So does anybody want to start us off? Yes. And if you could just share, if you're comfortable, you name and organization you work with, and maybe region of the state that you work within.
Pretty comfortable with that. I know my name. Mark Holman, and I work with Portland Community Reinvestment Initiatives. So that's that I-5 corridor you were talking about earlier. My question is that it's not for the faint of heart to try and manage or guess the passage of an appropriation and then when you could get the funding. So given that, and given that you don't want to have kind of like the Gantt chart from hell or something like that when you're trying to do your budgeting, how can you expedite the process most efficiently? And I was thinking of, should you hire a lobbyist or something to help, or would that be money not well spent?
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I'll say on the first part of that question, unfortunately, there's not a lot that can be done to expedite the process. It's very unsatisfying answer. But the process is unfortunately, going to be based on those congressional schedules, and those don't always make sense. Once the bills do pass, I mean, I think really, and Joel can speak to this a bit, having been involved with a couple of projects, one that's made it through and gotten the funding through the bill, and one that's in the middle of all this churn right now. So love to hear Joel's perspective on that. But once the bills do pass, the agencies go to work to get the money out. Since we've only been through 2 successful rounds of this since the hiatus, we have seen that the second year the money did get out into the community a little bit faster. So happy to talk more about kind of how those timelines were, and give somebody our best guess kind of moving forward. And then on the second point of that, is it helpful to bring in a government affairs pro to do this work? I won't say no to that. I think organizations do employ that. There are good people out there who are doing this work, who understand the process, who can allay some fears, help you get your materials in time, and help get your relationship shaped up so you're ready. So I think that is a great option for organizations who can afford that and who have enough federal work to sustain and justify a contract. That being said, for the last 7 years with Senator Merkley, I've been more than willing to kind of play that kind of quasi role for folks who are interested in working with our office. So congressional staff should be able to do some of that work for you to kind of help you get ready. It's part of what we're here for.
Thanks for adding that, Dan. That's exactly what I was thinking about. That's really what you're there for in a lot of ways, is to help navigate that. And I just want to emphasize that. I'll chime in. Tyler, you were going to say something. I don't want to stop your thought process on timing. Like, yeah, we all want it to be perfect timing, and we're also many of us are used to that brain damage of lining up all the different capital stacks and budget requests that we need. And I celebrate Christmas, and so it was the best Christmas present I received for our community last year. But that's like how long it took, right? It was like December 22nd, 2022. And here we are, end of September 2023. And I actually earlier today, I got an email that I think has the grant agreement in it based on that congressionally directed spending. So just a gut check on time. And that was a pretty seamless appropriations process in the whole scheme of things. And second year into, in this case, HUD having navigated the community project funding. Right. So some of the kinks were worked out. That's a pretty quick process. I don't know that it can go much faster than that. And again, it's kind of going to depend on where that money is going to flow through, what agency it's going to flow through. Some of them are more sophisticated than others. I'm not going to call out the less sophisticated ones that we've worked with, but there are a few federal agencies that are less sophisticated than others, right? And how they're managing their grants. But
to, if you've got to pin something down, I would tell my folks, when I was managing earmark requests, don't anticipate that the approps will pass until December. It used to be before August, but that's not the case anymore. So don't anticipate that it passes until December. And then I would say 6 months for an FFGA, full funding grant agreement, but sounds like maybe a little longer than that sometimes. I think the only things you can do to speed it up on the age to speed up the process are on the backside once the approps bill passes. And so that's having a scope, not just a scope of the project, but a scope of what that community directed spending request covers. Having that budgeted out, knowing how to prepare that so it's easy for the agency to navigate, which depends a little bit on each agency. So you can just try to plug it in a grant agreement as quickly as possible once they're literally going down a list. We've got 100 of these projects. We're just gonna put 2 staff on them and work through the list to write these grant agreements. But good luck.
My name is Brandon Brezik with Central City Concern, so also Portland Metro focused. We were recipients of congressionally directed spending. Initially, the conversation started with Senator Wyden's office, and Grace Stratton was a huge help for us navigating the initial kind of process. And I'm looking back through emails just to kind of confirm our timeline, just to kind of give you what it might look like. It was in March of last year where we first had the conversations about the project that we were scoping. And then, submitted the initial concept in April. And it was kind of like a waiting game, some updates over the course of last summer. And yeah, same thing, we were approved in December. But then this was a transitional housing that has a medical focus or medical clinical focus in it. So we were awarded through HRSA. So we had to apply through HRSA. I will say with regards to CCC does have policy folks, not specifically federal policy, but we try to keep good relationships with all the legislators, state and federal. But I will say being knowledgeable with grants.gov is very helpful. It's a very confusing website, but all the questions that I had, I was able to get a lot of help from the CDS emails and the state staff. But yeah, the grants.gov portal for whether you're getting through HUD or HRSA or other agencies. And we actually just found out on Monday that our HRSA NOFA that we responded to was officially awarded. And we have to go through the whole grant execution process now. Hopefully that and the actual receipt of the funding doesn't get too held up with the federal shutdown imminent. But yeah, and I think as far as picking a project that fits the prolonged timeline is definitely key for us. It was the second phase of a project. So something that we could kind of sit on a little bit and wait. But I will say for at least the funding that we did, FF&E and some permitting is reimbursable. So to find out what is reimbursable so you can identify that, and the budget that you submit you break that out within it. So that's just some tips and tricks. And then I guess another question that I have, so given that we did work through Senator Wyden's office for our first foray into it, probably since earmarks were a thing back a decade ago, should we, you mentioned, Tyler, that it's typically going to be a once and special project that you're going in for to target these CDS funds. If we did want to try to go back for it again, should we go through Senator Wyden's office, or should we bring the opportunities to the other legislators? What would be the best approach for if you're trying to make this or tap into these funds again? What would you suggest?
I can answer from my office, but Dan might have. I would say, I think I would be intentional about what you are asking for, because earmark funds are not intended to be part of an annual operations process or money that an organization relies on. But if you are saying here is a different project, and I would, if I were your lobby, if I were a lobbyist, I would tell you actually want it to look very different, right? If your previous case was related to medical inpatient care and housing and providing that, can you do something with workforce training, connections to affordable, like just something totally different. So I would urge you to think about that. And I think, I think at that point, you can go to any of the offices. And I would generally encourage everyone to go to all of the offices regardless, because we all talk to each other and it tends to work better. Like if I'm calling Dan, I'm like, what do you think about this request? And if he's like, I haven't heard anything about it. Like, that's a moment that's a little, I'm like, that's odd. Why not? Like, okay. And then I just dig a little bit deeper, which isn't a problem, but ideally you don't want to have any flags at all. So I encourage folks to go to all relevant offices. And I think in that situation, I mean, call us, we're super happy to chat, but I think I would encourage you to think about all of them.
Yeah, and some procedural housekeeping too. So on the Senate side, Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden have a joint process. So whether you're working with one, the other, or both, you go to one website, enter it, it gets to all of our staff, and our teams, do collaborate on that work. Also, it's useful to keep in mind too that the Senate bill and the House bill are, until the very, very end of the process, totally different things. And so, there are requests that come to our House members that don't get made on the Senate side, and vice versa. There's a congressional district that doesn't, whose member of Congress doesn't submit requests. So that's a dynamic. And we found in the past, I mean, there's like so much that goes on, like, procedurally behind the curtain with these things throughout the year. But we've also found that, if two projects, if the same project is in both the House and the Senate bill and it gets merged, it gets like that, whatever that funding request was. If they're, two similar but different projects, one in the House side, one in the Senate side, and they both make it through to the end, then like both of those projects get funded. So there's like some strategy involved in that, which is a thing you can talk to your congressional contacts about and float that by them. Hey, have you talked to your senator about this, or your member of the House? And then just kind of proceed from there.
Hi, my name's Lydia and I work at Northwest Housing Alternatives. We work across the state of Oregon. And I'm thinking particularly about work that we do in rural communities where there's really no local funds to leverage in addition to the state resources that we're always going after and highly competitive. So I'm curious, I think both from the federal level and then Joel, from your perspective, kind of this, you mentioned, no one wants to be the first ones in. And unfortunately, that's kind of always the case. No one ever wants to be the first ones in. So I'm thinking in a rural community, this could be an incredible, compelling story, right? Why the need for this one-time funding, because there is no other local resources, kind of how that lands as that story. And then Joel, your perspective of, the compellingness, do you apply to this first and then OHCS first and then this, like, how does that, how do those two layers, the federal and the state layers, play together?
Joel, I think you should answer that.
I should go first, huh? So like in my experience, it's been a couple of things. We're lucky to have a very supportive housing authority in the region, of which I help to run. And, again, acknowledging the leveraging of other federal programs is huge in that. And that's something we've heard from the senator's office in particular. Not only because we're leveraging the funds, but we have experience working with our federal partners in administering the grants. Like, we have that track record, right? And there are housing authorities that work in every single county of the state. So if I can help you in those relationships, let me know. There's a few housing authorities here in the room as well, like Nicole up there in Salem. So, and then, the strategy of who goes first. We were, I think it was a little point of not contention, but question when we actually had, had to go in 2 rounds at the state before we were awarded one, a big chunk of the capital stack. And that was just, it was a communication thing that we just needed to keep going. It's like, I would call Dan and be like, hey, Dan, how's it looking? And he's like, well, how's it looking on your side? I'm like, well, we're working our hardest, and just keeping the lines of communication open. And in that communication, just educating about the process at the state and then learning more about the process at the federal level, I think was really helpful in doing that. And so we have, just more specifically, one that we were able to bring in and then we were funded, so a federal, and then we were funded at the state. And then we have another project that, we have the request in at the federal level, and we don't have the state funds too. So I guess they're both the same. But in both cases, they're leveraging, in our case, the project-based vouchers that are going to be part of the development. Yep.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd also encourage folks to talk to your contacts at the state about this same thing too. This directed spending is just kind of one small, pie here, but there's also, all the investment programs through the infrastructure bill that passed a couple of years ago. And, the states have realized that, they can handle some policy tweaks to kind of harmonize their programs to leverage more federal dollars. And I know the state legislature has, made a couple actions on that this last long session. I'm not sure if there were any in the housing realm, but it's something that we're talking about more and just trying to foster is more, back and forth between state folks and feds to, get as much pooled resources into the state.
I think the last thing I'll add to that is you can be a little bit creative about what funds or what ways there have already been investments. So like, if the land was bought 10 years ago, think about the cost of that as part of funding that's already been put into the project. Again, your congressional offices are always super happy to talk with you about how to maybe prepare that and think about that a little bit. So give yourself some creativity.
I think we have time for like one more question. There's a burning question in the room. I know I'm looking at the back of everybody's heads and faces, so I can't see if there's a burning question. I guess if there's no other questions, I want to just say thank you for unveiling a little bit of the process and the relationship building and being a bit vulnerable and kind of sharing more about yourselves and what works in those relationships. And I guess while I still have the mic, asking you the questions like, how do we maintain them, right? How do we, what are your parting words for like, what's the best thing we can do to just like the long game with your offices? I know, you've mentioned, Tyler, some of your transition in your career and, there's staff changes that happen. And so it's not just that individual relationship too, it's a deeper engagement that we need to do for the long game. So maybe your send off to us is, how do we plan for the long game here?
Speaking of transitions, I think what I would say is you want ideally to become the organization that the office can call when they don't understand something, right? Hey, we're hearing this. It doesn't really line up with some other things. Can you provide some context? And playing that, Dan and I both have folks that we call about that all the time. When I worked at Metro, that, and I was handling federal affairs as part of my job, I always wanted to be the person that they would call. They'd be like, well, one county's saying this and one city's saying this, and I don't understand. I wanted to be the person that they would call to talk through that. If you are that person, you are in the exit memo, right? So that means whoever's taking over that job is going to be like, oh, okay, so I got to build some relationships. All right, I need to call these folks. And that ideally is where you want to be. So that can be, and that again, speaking of transitions, I assume that everyone here experiences professional transitions as well, right? So you can put a lot of energy into building those relationships. And you can hand them over to a trusted colleague when you leave. I think we all, no one expects this work to be a life sentence. But setting up your organization to be the sort of, look, we're going to be objective. We're going to really tell you what's happening. We're going to answer the question fully. We're going to help you do a better job staffing your boss. That's sort of a long-term relationship.
And I just want to thank you all for being here for today and all the great work that you do. And Joel for facilitating us here today. Great conversation. And thank you for being the person that I call when I don't understand something.
And my pleasure. Yeah, well, let's give them a round of applause and thank you. Again, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your conference here at Housing Oregon.